hands-on games, role-playing, dramatization, and storytelling. Just like Crashton said earlier this morning in the keynote, making it compelling. When he made the reference to the cartoon, they want to understand. So when you do things like this to get them engaged, then it makes it more compelling and comprehensive. So I put an elementary example for you here. Sorry. I teach K through 6. This is the first year I've had 4th, 5th, and 6th. I've usually predominantly focused on K through 3 for the last 5 years. And these students, when they're in kindergarten and first grade, they're on a pretty level playing field in some ways with their English-speaking peers because they're both learning to read and write together at the same time.
Engaged. You guys do this very well. Daily communication, conferences, emails, texts, and calls. Dojo is great for that. Newsletters, calendars, school social media. Invite them to join Brighton's Facebook page. Miss Morgan does a great job updating that. School website, and invite them to participate when you guys know all of this, but they just ask us to kind of include some tips for parent interaction. Smile, because this is really crazy right now. I don't know how I'm so admire that, some of the things that all of you guys are doing, because I know that it's very difficult. When you have something negative to say, try to leave with a positive. Use a translator when you can. Either, and it can never be a student. It has to be, either an adult or even an app or something. A lot of you guys use Google Translate, things like that. That's fine. Ask questions about their child and get their input. Invite the parent to share information. Sometimes this can be personal because we all know that socio-emotional factors also really affect the kids and their learning. Be specific, explain your decisions for instruction, consider their input, and share successes when you guys have them so that they feel like they're a part of the team. So the first thing I want to call to your attention are the school parent compacts, and it looks like this. I just brought you a red folder last week,
English
and it has
this one too could be a little dubious. Good deal. You're going to seek their access score from a previous district. 10 times, 9 times out of 10, we're able to get that score. Sometimes if they're from another country, we just go ahead and screen. If they're from another district that's, in the United States, we either ask, and if it's been an extended amount of time, in some circumstances, we will have to screen the child. But most of the time, you can get something from the other district too. That's not a year old that you can use to identify them.
Kristen, how long would you, or should we wait if that happens, or should we be checking with the board to see, or with?
Well, we have a 10-day timeline. So typically when I have to, when I request records, I make note of the date and of course do it by email. So we have the paper trail on it. And I'll request it, within a day or two of arrival. And if that doesn't work, I'll call about halfway through.
Yep.
And if you pass the 10 days, if it's going on, 14, 15 days, obviously you're working on the situation. Usually if it goes past 15 days, I'll go ahead and screen just if I get no response.
Okay.
I don't know if there's an official answer for that since we have 10 days, but that's personally kind of what I try to do as my guideline.
Gotcha.
And just keep dates on everything. See. When a new ESL student is identified, who is notified about that? Good deal, everyone. That's right. COB needs to know classroom teacher and parents. Miss Putt is getting it this morning. Next one, multiple choice. How many days do we have to identify potential students at the beginning of the year when everyone comes back? You are correct. 30 days. Obviously, you have an influx of new students and you have everybody to identify at one time. So in the beginning of the school year, from the date that school starts, we have 30 school days. And everybody knows that. Good deal. If you screen a student in their access, okay, that was a good question. Anna, can you unmute yourself and ask that? Just because
Yeah,
thank
my
you.
question was like, if we screen a student and they screen as a 1.0 just because they don't care, and
Right.
then later their access records turn up, which score would we go with? Like the current screener that we did or the access test that they took last spring?
I honestly would go with the official test. I've actually
Okay.
never had that happen, but that's a very good question. And it's
That's why I said detailed. It's
no, yeah,
small chance.
if you know they didn't give the effort that's necessary to, and they have a higher score, you can also take in consideration their grades and how they're performing in class. And if you feel like, okay, a 1.0 is not, what they're demonstrating in class, so we're going to go with this. There are a ton of things to consider, and it's and I know that Miss Putt mentioned earlier, like it looks totally different in secondary. A lot of times you're supporting the students instead, or the teacher. And those are some considerations that I put in here. But I guess I kind of made this with a small group in mind, working around a master schedule for a school. It's a lot to consider when you're trying to do things effectively. So here are the ways that I personally consider forming groups or supports for students. So the main factors you want to consider when you're putting students together to receive their support or services is, of course, first and foremost, their proficiency score. You want to go by their language proficiency level, and it should be the guiding factor, if at all possible, for most of your grouping or your support. Prime example of this would be if you have a newcomer, obviously they're going to need a lot more support than students that have been living in the U.S. and attending school here. So, proficiency is number one factor to consider. Second one is age appropriate peers. Students are grouped with students of an acceptable age range. If you have, a fifth grade student that comes in and doesn't know how, say they speak Arabic or some other language that uses characters and not, Latin alphabet, you might be teaching letters and sounds to them and teaching them how to read, but it's not appropriate to group them with lower levels where you're doing that with lower level kids. So if you are working with kids that are in the fifth grade and they also need to read the word cat, you can't say, well, they can just come to my first grade group. They're working on that word, those CVC words. That's not okay. We have to do something different for them and individualized. The master schedule is a bear. It's not fun. You have to be mindful of their core subject time. You don't want to take them out of math, and you want to try to leave them in, as much of their reading as possible. Their I have all the materials for it. So I do a little student phonics placement test just to see, do they know how to read anything? Are they able to sound anything out? I do, if on kindergarten and first, I do a letter and sound assessment, just trying to see, what they need. Because to make best use of the time, that gives me a little bit more of an idea of what they're capable of versus just an access score. Because reading is a 3.3, that's great, but I don't really know what that specifically means they're good at. Does that make sense? The second thing I do is I do some student interviews. I'll get to know them, and also just talking with them kind of gives you a sample of how fluent and automatically they are able to speak with you, which is good for speaking practice. I try to take writing samples once a month just to show them, how their writing has changed, and obviously whatever you're thinking in your head, you're going to write on your paper. So it shows language development too, because they're thinking the thought and then writing the thought down. And then, of course, the biggest challenge is being as consistent as possible, because with all the paperwork and now with COVID and covering classes and, obviously it's very challenging to do, but trying to be consistent. And it basically has every piece of information that you need in it, and so you can just copy it if you have a question about that. So I'm going to walk through that with you and show you, and then we're going to look at some folders and see what is not there and what should be there. So let's see. All right, we looked at this. This is the one that I did at PLC, so we won't spend a whole lot of time on this. But we're going to look at new student identification and placement. So we've already talked a little bit about how new students are identified, what all the steps look like, how we need to notify the board office, tracking down scores and records, their WIDA screener, paperwork and programs, and timelines. So again, how do I know if I have a new student in my building? So your point of, especially if you're like me and you have more than one school, it's very important to have a plan in place for how you're going to identify when you get a new kid. Now, a lot of the times, the parents will struggle with registration. You know, they'll come in and they don't speak the language, and that's very obvious. And, you know, a lot of times the secretary will just naturally contact you because they're not able to assist them. Would anybody care to unmute themselves and kind of let me know or let us know how they, the relationship they have with their registrar, or what your plan is, if there's a home language that comes in? Does anybody want to share?
I honestly don't get anything from mine. I like my registrars, but it's rare that I get a notification. They usually base it off of the students' language skills when they're talking to them.
And you're
And it's just,
secondary, right?
yeah, high school.
Yeah, see, I could totally see that. Home language surveys in the office, just typically English and Spanish, unless they, you know, don't speak that language, and then hopefully we can get a hold of that and have them fill it out on paper. So it's not going to hurt us to have two different copies. You know, you can have the paper one, and then they can also do it in online enrollment. So the process, just as a flow chart, if that is better, you know, visual for you, home language student is what we use to identify potential students. Then we have to either look up records or give them a screener. We have to screen if they are new to the U.S. or we cannot obtain records. And then we notify COB if they're a non-float, an EL, an EL2, or a former English learner. Again, home language survey, the category that they're going to go in. Are they an in-district transfer, out-of-district transfer, or immigrant? Then you're going to get request their records or give them a screener, 10-day timeline, NELB page. That is very important to do, and we're going to talk about that a lot when we get to the yellow folder section here in a minute. Get the yellow folder going, and then you're going to notify the COB once you get all the info that goes on this page. Updating Elevation and Power School, then do their IELP, sign and review with teachers and principal and, you know, parent if available. So the new student checklist, I know you've all seen this. This is just something that I made because I like to be able to check things off, and things don't always happen in order either. Sometimes you'll get a piece of information or something will happen that, you know, happens before another step that you typically would do. So I've already shared this with you guys before, but this little grid up here helps a lot because you have their enrollment date, you have their previous district, and then as I mentioned to Tyler earlier, I put here records request sent date. That way, you know, I have proof and I have an email to back up that I requested records on the second day they were here, didn't see anything on the 10th day, so I followed up and then went ahead and screened. And then all of these things have to be done. It looks like a lot of stuff, and we're going to go through Elevation and Power School as well to make sure everything's added there. But anybody have questions on this? Like, has this helped y'all at all? Is it Are there any questions on this list here? Is it all pretty self-explanatory?
It definitely helped me. I just had to use it this week.
I just felt like there was, and it's been updated for this year because this year has been crazy with Power School. So it helps me to keep track of all the things that need to be done. Um, and of course, we've talked about the NELB form digitally that needs to go to the coaches so that they can code them. Because one thing missing, one thing that doesn't belong. There is her withdrawal and transfer form from her other school. Oh, she was online or something. She had an online school she went to. There's her current 2021 IELP. Her NELB form with her screener information. Her home language survey. Her new student checklist with all of her information on it. So again, for her, we're looking for one thing missing, one that doesn't belong. And remember, this is a kindergartner. So what could possibly be missing from her that we should have access to? You ready for the answers? Good deal. Let's look at, I see some correct answers coming across from the little text chat thing. Her initial placement test info is missing, and you are correct. The withdrawal form does not belong. Like I said, sometimes it can be very difficult to obtain that very first placement info, especially if they are a transient student. But Miranda was here in kindergarten with us, so there's no reason why we should not have that included in her folder. So her initial placement test info is missing, and we don't need to put the withdrawal form in the yellow folder. The withdrawal form will be in her CUME file, so there's no need for it to go specifically with ESL. Are these okay? So everybody okay so far? Like since I'm sharing my screen, I can't see all the chats. I feel like I'm just, if you want to share anything or ask anything, just share it out.
You're doing great.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Or what it might look like when you are registering a new student. So what could happen in the space? So number one, we have a home language survey and it's got Arabic on there. And the student is coming from a neighboring Jeffco Ed school. So what are you probably going to do next? You go in the office and you're like, oh, they've got Arabic on their home language and they're coming from Gardendale to Fultondale. What would probably happen next? Anybody want to share what they think, what they would do next?
Contact the ESL teacher and get a yellow.
That's what I would do.
Exactly. Exactly. Contact the ESL teacher there, or Cindy, one of the coaches, will have this information as well and get their score. Hope if they're coming from Jeffco Ed, we should have everything you need. And so that would probably be what's happening here. Number 4, officially notify the COB of the school change. If they withdraw, you don't necessarily have to, but it's good to let them know, just it's still going to update in Power School and Elevation, but just, you can let the coaches know, hey, they're moving from here to here and I might need some info or whatever, or the ESL colleague. Then what are you going to add them to after all of that's done? Because you don't have to screen them. That's that you already have an access score. And they're already active, they're already placed. So what's going to happen around step 5? What are some things we could do? We got to add them to what? 2 things.
School
Elevation
special
and
programs.
Yeah, there you go. Power School special programs. You add them to your caseload, and then you're going to add them into, you're going to update their info in Elevation with, at the beginning. We're going to look at Elevation too, but at the beginning where you, their teacher, their language, all that kind of stuff, their school, you update that. So that'll be there. And then you're going to speak with their teacher about their proficiency and put them in a small group. Because if they're in an in-district transfer, it cuts out a lot of the guesswork and the screening and placements and all that kind of thing, trying to figure out where they are. All right, next scenario. What's going to happen first? And then we realize the student moved here from Mexico. What's probably going to happen before we realize that? Hopefully you have a secretary or a registrar that's going to communicate with you.
Home language survey.
Exactly. Home language survey, or they're registering and the secretary notices that they have a foreign birth certificate. And they're going to be like, oh, okay, here's what we do. They just got here from Mexico. They've never lived here before. So what's going to happen next?
Screener.
In the U.S. Very good. We're going to take a screener and notify COB. From what I understand, you don't have to have their student ID number to give them a screener, but personally, I kind of like to have that just in case, there's a dual record somewhere or anything. So I typically notify COB first, and so they can code them, and then once I get that student number from the registrar, then I'll put them in and screen them. So then you're going to complete their NELB form for the folder and their digital one for the COB. You're going to add them to PowerSchool and into Elevation, and you're going to write their IELP. Next one, you have already administered the screener and the kid qualified. You've already notified the parent, the teacher, and the COB. What happens next before you write the IELP? Put them in a group. Start pulling the kids. Yeah, I typically right here, after you've notified, you're like, okay, we have a new student. That's when you go ahead and update your Elevation and your PowerSchool. And there's no right or wrong answer here because you obviously need to put them in a group as well. It's just something or any utility bills at this time. What will happen next?
Mark them homeless.
Yes. Well, talk to your homeless liaison for sure. So basically we have in Jefferson County tried to adopt this whole, well, it's not tried to, it's some people have an easier time doing this than others, but you enroll first, ask questions later. In other words, if they have a birth certificate, you can verify the age, go ahead and enroll them. Now the vaccination record does have to be an Alabama form. They will have to take care of that, but that's something the health department is familiar with. They just take it down there and they can either transfer it, translate it and transfer it to an Alabama form. And if they don't have a lease or utility bills, then that's okay. I mean, they've got the bare minimum that they need. They probably will be looking at a second party registration, but if they have ORR paperwork, that means they're a refugee and they've been relocated and they will need to be coded as homeless too. So work with your counselor or whoever your homeless liaison is. And so enroll first, ask questions later. Any questions on this? Has anybody encountered something like this?
To that, so I've got Acadori. They refuse to let me enroll some of the students if they don't have all of that paperwork.
I've run into that problem too at my new schools.
Yes.
It's the same at the high school.
And again, secondary is so different because I understand with secondary, there's a matter of credits and, transcripts and things like that, for graduation.